Okay guys, this is Mr. Cannon here again, and today we're going to be looking at the first part of World War II. This is a two-part lesson, so we're going to be looking at the first part today. Primarily, we're going to be looking at the war itself today. In the next lesson, we'll look at the home front and the Holocaust and several events like that. But today we're really going to focus on the war itself. The first thing we need to talk about when it comes to World War II is how we got to the point that war is going to break out. And a lot of it has to do with the rise of dictators in Europe during the 1930s, the rise of fascism, totalitarian regimes. All this is referring to basically the same thing, where you had a person who would take over the military, rise to power, use that military to conquer areas and to control as much as they could. And this was going on in Europe in part due uh, to the catastrophe of the Great Depression. A lot of times when you see the rise of really strong leaders who can really become fascist or totalitarian leaders, it's often in times of crisis. And certainly the crisis was this economic depression, made worse in Germany by the fact that they were being punished by the Treaty of Versailles, this treaty which had forced them to give up land, forced them to admit guilt for World War I, which wasn't all their fault, and forced them to pay reparations, which they couldn't afford to pay. It really put Germany in a tough position. And so Hitler, who's the most famous of all of these dictators, is going to rise to power in Germany, promising to bring about change and promising to get back the people, he was referring to England and France, who had punished them so severely. And that is going to resonate. That message is going to resonate with the German people, who are going to say, absolutely, this is what we want. We want a leader who promises to fix the problem and then to get the people who created this problem. And in their minds, they were referring to England and France. And so that's why Hitler was able to rise to power in Germany. Now, in Italy, we had Benito Mussolini, who is on the left there of Hitler in the photograph. In Japan, we had the rise of these totalitarian regimes. The emperor's name was Hirohito. The military leader's name was Tojo, and it's often debated who controlled more of the country and more of the war out of the two men. But there's no doubt that these countries were trying to expand their spheres of influence. Germany was certainly trying to conquer as much land as they could, but Japan also was had invaded China and was trying to get as much land as they could in Asia. The United States, as we see all of this happening, is so isolationist. We want to remain neutral. We want to stay out of it. That as we see Japan going on a rampage in Asia, we pretty much don't do anything. And so that helps to contribute to the problem. Now, we also had the rise of a dictator in the Soviet Union as well. His name was Joseph Stalin. Stalin is going to be a big problem as well, but not a problem for us in World War II, because Stalin was also an enemy of Hitler, and we'll look at that in a little while. The European response. England and France basically responded to Hitler early by appeasing him. It's called the policy of appeasement, where they basically allowed him to take some land in the hopes that he would be satisfied and quit taking any more. It's very similar to one of my children if they're throwing a tantrum and they want candy, so I give them candy to get them to stop throwing a tantrum. Now, I may have helped myself in the short term, but in the long term, the next tantrum they throw is just going to be worse because I gave in to the first one. Well, the same thing was true here. The idea that Hitler was going to be appeased was wrong. Hitler was never going to stop taking land. And so by the time England and France actually decide they have to stand up to Hitler, it's almost too late. He's grown too strong and too powerful to stop. Our response, of course, to all of this is neutrality. The United States, because we were going through the Depression, because we still had a bad taste in our mouth from the end of World War I, the United States wants to remain completely out of these affairs. Now, credit to our president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, he understood the danger that was there, and he desperately wanted to get involved in some way. The Congress, however, passed these neutrality acts, which made sure that it limited how much we could do to help the Allies in Europe, how much we could help England and France. And so Roosevelt was sitting there basically tied up, hamstrung, and not able to do what he wanted to do. These neutrality acts really forced us to keep us out of the war and limited what we could do. In the meantime, you've got Hitler in Europe who has annexed Czechoslovakia, who's basically invaded Czechoslovakia and Poland. And when he does that, when he invades Poland and he takes over Czechoslovakia and then invades Poland, that's going to be the end of appeasement. At that point, England and France have no choice but to declare war, and we have war in Europe. Hitler then violates his own pact that he has with the Soviet Union. He had an agreement with them, a non-aggression agreement, where they each promised not to attack the other. He violated that and invaded the Soviet Union. And before you know it, Hitler is moving so quickly through these areas, he is conquering much of this land. He's got much of the Soviet Union under his control, not all, but a lot. And he's completely overrun France very quickly. So basically what you have is the Soviet Union hanging on by a thread, hanging on as best they can, and England, who only by the fact that they are an island are hanging on as he constantly bombards them with his air force. So Europe is at war, and Hitler is very quickly overrunning a lot of these areas. He uses a tactic called blitzkrieg. That's where we get the term blitz in football from, where he moves in very quickly and efficiently and overruns you before you can even respond. So you get a chance to study that more in depth. If you've never studied that, I would urge you to be able to do that. We don't really have time in this lesson to do that, but if you could, if you want to, you could study the tactic called blitzkrieg and see exactly how Hitler was able to overrun a lot of these areas. Now, eventually the United States, because that's what we're going to focus on here, our role is going to shift a little bit. Franklin Roosevelt is going to be able to convince the Congress to give him a little more leeway to help the Allies. And that's where the policies called cash and carry and lend-lease programs pass so that we can aid England and France and even the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, we understood they were a danger in and of themselves. They were an enemy to us. We understood that. Stalin was a bad dude. But the bigger threat during this period was Germany and Hitler. So as the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the enemy of Germany were the Soviets, so therefore the Soviets temporarily were our friends. So we're going to aid them through these programs. Lend-Lease, we're going to supply a lot of materials and weapons to these areas, but we are still going to stay out of the war. We're not going to become fully involved. Now, even prior to our official entry into the war, we're already in America making preparations for war. And we are, we are supplying Europe with a lot of things. We also are creating a lot of our own stuff in preparation for a possible war. We were smart enough to do that. We are already involved in an undeclared naval war with Germany because they are attacking our shipping. They're sinking our shipping. So we already know that we kind of are in an undeclared war. But officially, we don't enter World War II until December 7th, 1941, when we are surprise attacked in Hawaii at a naval base called Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan attacks us in a surprise move. And that attack by Japan is going to bring us into the war not only against them, but also against Germany, as Japan and Germany were allies, were friends. And so once we declare war on Japan, we now are also at war with Germany. Now, just to go back for a minute and talk a little bit about Japan. Japan had been building up their sphere of influence. They wanted to gain more control in Europe, or excuse me, not in Europe, but in Asia. So they actually are going to become way more involved in China and actually overrun China. And the United States just sort of sits back and allows a lot of this to happen. Because of our policy of isolationism prior to World War II, we're going to see Japan really emerge and get bigger and bigger, and we're not going to really do anything about it. So by the time we are attacked, we're sort of behind the 8 ball. Perhaps we could have perhaps if we had been more involved, if we had not been as isolationists, we could have maybe avoided some of what happened during the war, although that's just speculation. All right, let's talk a little bit about the battles in Europe, okay? We can't possibly talk about all the battles that occurred in World War II in Europe and the Pacific. Some of you are very interested in this stuff, and some of you know a lot already about these battles. And I would urge you, if you are interested, to continue studying them on your own, to continue to learn as much as you can about them. They are very interesting. But in our course, we have so much to cover that we can't talk about each of the battles. So I understand if you're a little frustrated, you're like, I really wanted to learn more about the battles. You'll have to do that in your own research because we just don't have time to do that. But we do need to talk about some of them. All right, so France had been overrun early in the war, and we've got Britain under constant bombardment from the German Air Force. That's called the Battle of Britain. The Soviets on the other side of the continent in Europe are taking huge casualties. And really the only real front in the war at this time is in the Soviet Union, where they are putting everything that they can into stopping Hitler. And they are able, one of the things the Soviets do is they're able to lure Hitler further and further into the Soviet Union simply by fighting as hard as they can and then retreating, and fighting as hard as they can and retreating, and it draws Hitler further in. It was a tactic that was successful for Russia in their war with Napoleon Bonaparte. And the same thing's going to happen here in World War II as well. Now, our first move in getting involved in Europe was to actually not start a front on the western side, which the Soviets desperately wanted us to do. The Soviets begged England and the United States to set up a second front that could relieve what they were doing on the Eastern Front, but we did not do that. Instead, we sent a lot of our Air Force and bombers to help the British, who were being constantly bombarded there. So in other words, we sort of sent a message that if it comes between England and the Soviet Union, we are going to help England first. We also eventually are going to launch an attack in northern Africa. Again, this does not open up another front in the war, which is what the Soviets desperately wanted to happen. But what it does do is it helps achieve our goal of freeing the Mediterranean Sea from Germany. Germany, by controlling northern Africa, are able to control the Mediterranean Sea, which is a big deal. So by launching an attack in northern Africa, we're eventually going to be able to free the water route there for us to be able to use it and for the Allies to be able to use that water route. It's only when we invade Italy that a second front is going to open to relieve the Soviet Union. And when we open that front in Italy, it is going to relieve it a little bit, but it's not going to really be until the invasion of Normandy, also known as D-Day, that we start to see Germany really have to turn from the Soviet Union, where they've gotten way too deep. It's winter, and they are struggling because they didn't bring enough winter clothing, and they have to turn and send a lot of their troops to another front in the war to stop the invasion of Normandy. Of course, D-Day, you can see the photograph there, that is of our soldiers invading the beaches of Normandy. A great movie for this. It is very violent. It is very accurate, but to show D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, the very first part of Saving Private Ryan does a really good job of that. So the movie Saving Private Ryan, if you really want to know just a little bit of what that could look like. Now, certainly we can't really experience what those soldiers experienced, but just a sliver, just a little bit of what they may have experienced. If you watch that movie, the first 30 minutes of it, it'll give you an idea of what they were looking at here. It was a very brutal battle, but it was a battle that the Allies are able to win, and we are able to take that part of France back. And that's going to start turning the tables in this war. What's going to shift the war for good and make it become clear that the Allies are going to win is when we win the Battle of the Bulge. And you can study that battle more if you would like, but the Battle of the Bulge was a huge Allied victory and is going to be the beginning of the end for Germany. Hitler had gotten himself too spread out, and he had too many soldiers on both sides of him attacking him. Now, we owe a lot to the Soviets because the Soviet Union really did a number on Hitler's troops on the Eastern Front. But in return, the Soviets are going to lose so many soldiers. They're going to take heavy casualties. And the Soviets are going to feel like they're owed something after the war because they did take so many casualties. And of course, that's going to help bring about the Cold War, which we'll look at in another unit. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the Pacific. So we had war in Europe. We had war with Hitler in Europe, and we are going to be able to win that. Well, we also are going to have war in the Pacific. And our strategy in the Pacific battles was called island hopping. Basically, we were going to take one step at a time, one island at a time in our struggle to get to the Japanese mainland. We did experience an unexpected victory at Midway. You may know the story there at Midway of the message that we're able to use, encoded message using Navajo Native Americans, and we're going to be able to put Japan on the defensive with that victory at Midway, and that's sort of going to set the stage for our victory in the Pacific. So that's an important battle to remember, Midway. We also are going to achieve victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but they're going to come at a huge cost. What we're going to find is that the Japanese fight fiercely in these battles. So even though we're able to win them, we become very concerned that in order to take the Japanese mainland, it's going to require a lot of American casualties. American soldiers are going to die in large numbers taking that Japanese mainland. If the Japanese fought that hard at Iwo Jima and that hard at Okinawa, it's going to be very difficult for us to take the mainland. Now, we knew we could do it. We achieved victory. We knew we could do it. But the idea that we could lose anywhere from 250,000 to up to maybe even 1 million, that may be a little high, but that was some estimates. 1 million soldiers taking the Japanese mainland is where we're going to start talking about using the atomic bomb, the atom bomb, and that's what we'll look at next. Okay, so during the war, we're actually going to have a group of scientists that are going to work on what's called the Manhattan Project. And of course, that project was designed to build and make nuclear weapons. We began covertly doing this during the war in the hopes that we would not have to use these weapons, but in the fear that we would have to use them. So we built these weapons. This is where the world was heading. This is where the science was heading. And so we built them, and it was the fierce fighting in the Pacific that led our leaders to consider using them to avoid those heavy casualties we were afraid we would have to take if we invaded the Japanese mainland. Eventually, we do decide, the president at the time, who's President Truman, Harry Truman, was the vice president of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, Roosevelt, who is serving in his 4th term, is going to die. He's going to die unexpectedly, and Truman's going to become president. Now let's just have a side note here for a second. I just told you that Roosevelt was serving his 4th term when he passed away. That is no longer, presidents no longer can do that today. We added an amendment to the Constitution which limits the president to 2 4-year terms. That's all the president can serve. That goes back to the precedent that George Washington established of serving 2 terms. But because Roosevelt was president during both the Depression, which was a crisis, and during World War II, which was a crisis, the American people continued to elect him over and over because they desired his strong leadership. So Truman's going to take over, and he's going to make the decision to drop 2 atomic weapons, 2 nuclear weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both in August of 1945. Okay, you can see the photograph there. All right, that's Nagasaki. That is just a sliver of the devastation there. What was not wiped out in the initial blast, we see a lot more people die from the radiation poisoning that they're going to get. And then some people who got a little less radiation than others are actually going to die even years later from cancers. So it was a devastating effect on these areas. Dropping these 2 atomic bombs is going to show that the Japanese, that they really cannot stand up any longer, that they must surrender. So they are going to surrender and end World War II in 1945. Now, what this weapon also does is it shows the Soviet Union that the United States is not a country to be messed with. That the United States is a very, very powerful nation with very, very powerful weapons. There is some speculation that one of the reasons we dropped these weapons was as a warning to the Soviet Unions not to go too far after World War II. We knew that the Soviets were going to take some land after World War II, but the idea was don't go too far or this could be the result. And of course, the Soviets are developing their own nuclear weapons that they can threaten us with as well. Now, what we'll look at in the next unit is we're going to look at the actual home front. What was going on here in America while our soldiers are fighting overseas. But that's sort of a general, quick accounting of the war itself. As you watch this and as you go to answer the questions, if you have any, if there's a lack of understanding of any of this, or if you have any specific questions, feel free to send me a teacher message and I'll be happy to get back with you.